What if I told you that America once tested bioweapons on its own cities without telling anyone? That a serial killer built a hotel specifically designed for murder during a World's Fair? That people once believed eating radium would make them healthier until their jaws literally fell off? You've heard the sanitized version of American history, the founding fathers, the great wars, the triumphant moments. But beneath that surface lies a darker, stranger collection of facts, so disturbing, so bizarre, so genuinely unsettling that they rarely make it into textbooks. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to explore 101 verified facts about American history that will make you question what else you haven't been told. Not legends, not rumors, real events, documented and true, that reveal just how weird, dark, and inexplicable this country's past really is. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare to learn things you can never unlearn. Starting with a farm in Tennessee where bodies decompose in the open air, all in the name of science. The Body Farm. So, here's the thing about the Body Farm. Welcome to your bedtime documentary. If you're here, you're probably the kind of person who finds comfort in the strange corners of history, the parts they don't teach in school. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let me tell you about 101 verified facts about American history that are, let's say, unsettling. We'll start in Tennessee because, of course, we will. Since 1981, the University of Tennessee has operated what they politely call a research facility. Everyone else calls it the Body Farm. It's exactly what it sounds like. Acres of outdoor space where donated human bodies are left to decompose under carefully controlled conditions. Scientists study how time, weather, and insects affect decay. Over 1,800 bodies have been processed there. The goal is noble, helping forensic investigators solve crimes. But there's something deeply strange about the fact that somewhere in Tennessee, right now, dozens of bodies are just outside, returning to the earth, slowly. Which brings us to a president who dreamed of his own death. Lincoln's dream. Here's the thing about Lincoln's dream, it shouldn't be possible. Abraham Lincoln wasn't sleeping well in April of 1865. And honestly, who could blame him? The Civil War was ending, the country was shattered, and he just had the strangest dream. He told his bodyguard, on Ward Hill Laman, that he'd walked through the White House and heard weeping. Following the sound, he found a catafalque in the East Room with a corpse on display, surrounded by mourners. Lincoln asked a soldier, "Who is dead in the White House?" The answer, the president. He was killed by an assassin. Days later, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. His body was displayed in the East Room exactly as he'd dreamed. Now you can chalk this up to coincidence, or anxiety, or the weight of leading a nation through war. But the precision of that dream is hard to ignore, especially when you consider that Lincoln wasn't the only leader with secrets hidden underground. The Greenbrier Bunker. Here's the thing about the Greenbrier. You could have driven past it 1,000 times and never known. For 30 years, from 1958 to 1992, the United States government maintained a massive underground bunker beneath a luxury resort in West Virginia. The Greenbrier looked like a place where wealthy people played golf and ate expensive dinners. And it was. But it was also designed to house the entire Congress during a nuclear war. The bunker had 1,100 beds, a broadcast studio, a power plant, and, because someone thought ahead, a crematorium. Guests at the resort had no idea they were sleeping above a Cold War tomb. When the bunker was finally declassified in 1992, tours began. You can visit it today. Walk through the dormitories where senators would have slept while the world burned above them. It's sterile, eerie, and uncomfortably well preserved, which is sort of the theme of our next story. So, though in a much more intimate way, Post-mortem photography. Here's the thing about post-mortem photography that most people don't realize. It wasn't morbid to them. It was love. In the 1800s, photography was expensive and rare. For many American families, the only photograph they ever owned was of someone who had just died. Postmortem photography became a standard practice. The dead were posed in chairs, dressed in their finest clothes, sometimes with their eyes propped open to appear alive. Infants were photographed in their mother's arms. Children were surrounded by flowers. Adults sat upright, frozen in a moment that was already gone. But looking at those photographs now, there's an unmistakable strangeness. The stillness is too complete. The eyes, even when open, are somewhere else. These images were treasured, displayed on mantels, carried in lockets. Death wasn't hidden away. It was part of the family portrait. Speaking of portraits no one asked for, let's talk about a house that never stopped growing. The Winchester Mystery House. Here's the thing about the Winchester Mystery House. It wasn't built to be lived in. It was built to confuse the dead. Sarah Winchester's husband died in 1881. He'd made a fortune manufacturing rifles, and Sarah became convinced that she was being haunted by everyone ever killed with a Winchester rifle. A medium told her the only way to appease the spirits was to build, continuously, without stopping. So she did. For 38 years, construction crews worked around the clock on her San Jose mansion. Stairs were built leading to ceilings. Doors opened into walls. Rooms were constructed inside other rooms. When Sarah died in 1922, the hammering finally stopped. The house had grown to 160 rooms, spanning 6 acres, with no coherent design. It's a monument to grief, guilt, and possibly madness. Tours run daily now. Visitors walk through hallways that twist back on themselves, climb staircases that go nowhere. The house feels like a maze designed by someone trying to confuse death itself. And if you think that's the strangest object in a museum, wait until you meet Robert. Robert the doll. Here's the thing about Robert. He's just a doll. Except that people write him apology letters. In a museum in Key West, Florida, there sits a doll that people apologize to. Robert was handmade in the early 1900s and given to a boy named Robert Eugene Otto. The doll is about 3 feet tall, wearing a sailor suit, holding a stuffed lion. He looks harmless. He's not, according to hundreds of visitors who claim that disrespecting Robert, mocking him, photographing him without permission, leads to misfortune. Car accidents, broken bones, job losses. The museum receives apology letters addressed to Robert almost daily. Handwritten notes begging forgiveness, explaining that, yes, they laughed at the doll, and yes, their transmission failed the next day, and they're very sorry. Whether you believe in cursed dolls or not, the consistency of the reports is unnerving. Robert just sits there, button eyes staring, while people around him suffer consequences they can't quite explain. Though if you want unexplained consequences, let's talk about a witch that visited a president, or the Bell Witch. Here's the thing about the Bell Witch. Andrew Jackson encountered it personally, and he was not a man easily frightened. Between 1817 and 1821, the Bell family of Tennessee reported being terrorized by an invisible entity. It spoke in multiple voices, slapped family members, pulled hair, and threw objects across rooms. Neighbors witnessed it. Preachers tried to exorcise it. Nothing worked. The entity called itself Kate and claimed to be a witch. Andrew Jackson, before he became president, reportedly visited the Bell farm to investigate. According to family accounts, Jackson witnessed objects flying through the air and heard the witch's voice threatening his men. He left after one night, allegedly saying he'd rather fight the British again than spend another evening with the Bell Witch. The activity stopped in 1821, as suddenly as it began. But the story didn't, and neither did America's strange relationship with exhuming the dead. Mercy Brown, the vampire. Here's the thing about Mercy Brown. She was 19 years old, she died of tuberculosis, and then her neighbors dug her up and burned her heart. In 1892, the town of Exeter, Rhode Island, was being ravaged by tuberculosis. The Brown family had already lost several members to the disease. When Mercy died, her brother Edwin was still sick and worsening. Desperate, the townspeople suggested an old folk remedy: exhume the bodies of deceased family members and check for signs of vampirism. They dug up Mercy's mother and sister first, both fully decomposed. Then they dug up Mercy. She'd been dead 2 months and buried in frozen ground. Her body was still preserved. To the panicked townspeople, this was proof. They removed her heart, burned it to ashes, and mixed the ashes into a medicinal tea, which they gave to Edwin. He drank it. He died 2 months later anyway. Mercy Brown wasn't a vampire. She was a teenager who died of an infectious disease and was then desecrated by terrified neighbors. But speaking of terrified neighbors, let's cross the ocean briefly. Operation Paperclip. Here's the thing about Operation Paperclip. The United States government didn't just forgive Nazi scientists, it hired them. After World War II ended, the US government quietly recruited over 1,600 German scientists, many of whom had been active members of the Nazi Party. The program was called Operation Paperclip, named for the paperclips attached to the files of scientists whose backgrounds had been sanitized. Their war records were altered or erased. Their pasts were cleaned. And then they were brought to America to work on rockets, chemical weapons, and biological research. Werner von Braun, who helped design the V-2 rocket that killed thousands in London, became the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that sent Americans to the moon. The US government decided that their expertise was more valuable than their accountability. It's a choice that still echoes. You don't get to the moon without making deals with history. And speaking of things that won't stop burning, let's head to Pennsylvania, the Centralia mine fire. Here's the thing about Centralia. It's been on fire since 1962, and no one can put it out. Someone in Centralia, Pennsylvania, made a terrible mistake. They set fire to a trash pile in an abandoned coal mine to clean it out before Memorial Day. The fire spread into the coal seam below the town. It's still burning. 63 years later, the ground steams, sinkholes open without warning, and carbon monoxide seeps into basements. The town was evacuated in the 1980s. Only a handful of residents refused to leave. Route 61, which once ran through Centralia, is now cracked and buckled, with smoke rising through the asphalt. Graffiti covers the ruined road. The fire may burn for another 250 years. There's something apocalyptic about a town slowly consumed by a fire no one can stop. It's still there, smoldering, waiting. Though if you want something that's been waiting even longer, let's talk about coal seams of a different kind. The human kind. Mary Toph's American Imitators. Here's the thing about Mary Toph's American Imitators. They're a reminder that even experts can be fooled when they desperately want to believe. In 1726, a woman in England named Mary Toft convinced multiple doctors that she was giving birth to rabbits, actual rabbits, piece by piece. The hoax became international news before it was exposed. And because humans are excellent at learning the wrong lessons, several women in colonial America attempted similar hoaxes. They claimed to give birth to lizards, stones, and other biological impossibilities, and doctors believed them. For a while, monster births became a legitimate medical concern in the colonies, written about in journals, discussed in universities. Eventually, science caught up, but the fact that it took so long is a reminder that even experts can be spectacularly wrong when they want to believe something badly enough. Which brings us to a man who was alone with his wrongness for 5 very long months, the Byrd Antarctic expeditions. Here's the thing about Admiral Byrd's Antarctic ordeal. He survived it entirely alone, and he kept the worst of it secret for years. In 1934, Admiral Richard Byrd volunteered to spend 5 months alone at an Antarctic weather station, recording data in complete isolation. What he didn't tell anyone was that his stove was leaking carbon monoxide. Slowly, quietly, it poisoned him. His radio messages became increasingly incoherent. He wrote in his journal about hallucinations, about losing the ability to think clearly, about wondering if he'd make it. He was finally rescued, barely alive, after his support team realized something was wrong. Byrd kept the full extent of the ordeal secret for years. The diary he published later revealed a man slowly losing his mind in the coldest, loneliest place on Earth, knowing that help was months away. It's the kind of solitary suffering that makes other disasters feel almost communal. Speaking of disasters no one can explain, let's drive to California. The Dyatlov Pass of America. Here's the thing about the Yuba County Five. It's the American Dyatlov Pass, and it's just as inexplicable. In February of 1959, 5 men from Yuba City, California, drove to a basketball game in Chico. They never made it home. Their car was found abandoned on a remote mountain road, 70 miles from where they should have been. 4 bodies were discovered months later, scattered across the wilderness. One man was found in a trailer, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by food he never ate. Another was found miles away, shoeless, in the snow. The 5th man was never found. None of them had any reason to be on that road. None of them had experience in winter survival. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, just 5 men who seemingly walked into the wilderness and died. The case remains unsolved, which is frustrating, but at least those men were buried. Unlike our next subject, who traveled for 66 years, Elmer McCurdy, the traveling corpse. Here's the thing about Elmer McCurdy. He became more famous dead than he ever was alive, and for decades, no one even knew he was real. Elmer McCurdy was a criminal who died in a shootout in 1911. His body was embalmed with an arsenic compound so effective that it essentially mummified him. When no one claimed the body, the funeral home put it on display and charged admission. Eventually, McCurdy was sold to a traveling carnival, where he was exhibited as an outlaw mummy. For 66 years, his body traveled across America, appearing in sideshows, haunted houses, and wax museums. By the 1970s, everyone had forgotten he was real. In 1976, a film crew was shooting at a funhouse in Long Beach, California. They tried to move what they thought was a mannequin. Its arm broke off. Inside was a human bone. Elmer McCurdy had been hanging in a funhouse, mistaken for a prop for decades. He was finally buried in Oklahoma in 1977. But if you think that's the weirdest thing on display in a museum, buckle up, the soap lady. Here's the thing about the soap lady. She's been on display in Philadelphia since 1874, and no one knows her name. In Philadelphia's Mutter Museum, there is a display case containing a woman who died in the early 1800s. Her body never decomposed in a traditional way. Instead, the fat in her tissues converted into a waxy, soap-like substance called adipocere. It's a rare process that happens when a body is buried in moist, low-oxygen environments. The result is a perfectly preserved corpse that looks like it's been carved from dirty candle wax. No one knows who she was. Visitors walk past her every day, staring at the folds of her preserved skin, the hollow of her eye sockets. She's a Jane Doe suspended in her own biology, an anonymous monument to what happens when chemistry replaces decay. And if that's not strange enough for you, let's talk about meat falling from the sky. The Kentucky meat shower. Here's the thing about the Kentucky meat shower. It actually happened, and the scientific explanation is somehow more disturbing than the mystery. On March 9th, 1876, chunks of raw meat fell from a clear sky over Bath County, Kentucky. For several minutes, flesh rained down over an area roughly 100 yards long. Two men who were brave, or foolish, enough to taste it, said it resembled mutton or venison. Newspapers covered the story. Scientists investigated. The leading theory is that a flock of vultures, startled mid flight, simultaneously vomited up their recently consumed meals. Vultures do this when they need to flee quickly. It lightens their load. So, somewhere over Kentucky, dozens of vultures apparently panicked at once and regurgitated partially digested carrion. It's the most disgusting explanation and also the most scientifically plausible, which is somehow worse. Because if that's the rational answer, what does that say about the universe? Speaking of universes no one should have to live in, let's visit Chicago. H. Holmes's murder castle. Here's the thing about H. Holmes. He didn't just kill people. He built a building specifically designed to make it easier. During the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, a man named Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H. Holmes, built a hotel. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Inside, it was a maze of soundproof rooms, gas lines piped into bedrooms, a crematorium in the basement, and an acid vat for dissolving bodies. Holmes lured guests to his hotel, mostly young women visiting the fair alone, and murdered them. He confessed to 27 killings, but historians estimate the real number may exceed 200. The hotel was designed for murder. Secret chutes dropped bodies from upper floors to the basement. Hallways twisted in confusing patterns. Doors locked from the outside. After Holmes was caught and executed, the building was eventually torn down, but the site remains, and so does the memory of America's first known serial killer. Which brings us to another killer who was never caught, the Axeman of New Orleans. Here's the thing about the Axeman of New Orleans. He made a deal with an entire city, and the city kept its end of the bargain. Between 1918 and 1919, an unidentified killer terrorized New Orleans. He broke into homes at night and attacked families with their own axes. He killed 6 people and injured 12 others. Then, in March of 1919, he wrote a letter to the newspapers. In it, he claimed to be a demon from hell and said he would spare any home playing jazz music on the night of March 19th. The entire city played jazz that night. Every bar, every home, every street corner. New Orleans drowned itself in music, hoping to survive. No one was killed that night. The attacks continued sporadically afterward, then stopped. The Axeman was never identified. He vanished into history, leaving behind only bodies and one very strange letter. Speaking of strange letters, let's talk about one written to the dead. Thomas Edison's spirit phone. Here's the thing about Thomas Edison's spirit phone. This wasn't a fringe obsession. He talked about it openly in Scientific American. Edison spent the final years of his life trying to build a machine that could communicate with the dead. He called it a spirit phone. Edison believed that if ghosts existed, they were made of some form of energy, and energy could be measured and manipulated. He designed plans for a device sensitive enough to detect the presence of the deceased. The machine was never completed. After Edison's death in 1931, his notes on the project were studied by researchers and spiritualists alike. Some tried to recreate it. None succeeded. The idea that one of history's greatest inventors spent his final years trying to build a telephone to the afterlife is both sad and strangely hopeful. Though hope doesn't always help, as we'll see next. The Greenbrier Ghost. Here's the thing about the Greenbrier Ghost. It's the only case in U.S. history where a ghost's testimony contributed to a murder conviction. In 1897, a woman named Zona Heaster was found dead in her home in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Her death was ruled natural causes, but Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, wasn't convinced. She claimed that Zona's ghost appeared to her over 4 nights and described being murdered by her husband, Edward Shue. According to Mary Jane, the ghost said Edward had broken her neck in a fit of rage. Mary Jane went to the prosecutor and demanded the body be exhumed. They did. An autopsy revealed a broken neck and crushed windpipe. Edward Shue was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. The case is bizarre, legally questionable, and completely true. Speaking of truth hidden in stone, let's climb a mountain. Mount Rushmore's secret room. Here's the thing about Mount Rushmore. There's a room behind Lincoln's head, and almost no one knows it exists. Behind Abraham Lincoln's head on Mount Rushmore, there's a room. It's unfinished, carved into the granite, but never completed. Sculptor Gutzon Borglum intended it to be a hall of records, a vault preserving America's most important documents for future generations. Borglum died in 1941, and the project was abandoned. But in 1998, his vision was partially fulfilled. Porcelain panels inscribed with the text of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights were placed inside the chamber in a titanium vault. The entrance was sealed. Most visitors to Mount Rushmore have no idea it's there. A hidden archive inside a mountain, preserving the country's founding words in darkness. It's a time capsule for a civilization that might one day need reminding. And speaking of reminders we'd rather forget, let's talk about demons in Pennsylvania. The Smurl haunting. Here's the thing about the Smurl haunting. The Catholic Church took it seriously enough to send investigators. In 1986, the Smurl family of West Pittston, Pennsylvania, reported experiencing phenomena so severe that the Catholic Church sent investigators. The family described levitations, foul odors that appeared without source, shadow figures moving through rooms, and physical attacks they couldn't explain. Objects moved on their own. Voices whispered from empty spaces. The activity escalated over several years. Ed and Lorraine Warren, the paranormal investigators who would later become famous for the Amityville case, examined the home. They documented the family's claims and declared the house genuinely afflicted. The Smurls eventually moved out. Whether you believe in demonic activity or not, the fact remains that a family was so disturbed by events in their home that they abandoned it and invited the church to intervene. Their fear was real, even if the source remains debated. And speaking of sources no one can identify, let's tune into something that's been broadcasting for decades. Number stations. Here's the thing about number stations. You can tune into one right now, tonight, and no government will ever officially admit they exist. Since the Cold War, mysterious shortwave radio stations have broadcast sequences of numbers, letters, and tones across the airwaves. They're called number stations, and they operate worldwide, including transmissions originating from U.S. territory. The broadcasts follow patterns: a series of beeps, a voice reading numbers in monotone, then silence. They repeat at scheduled intervals. The widely accepted theory is that these are coded messages from intelligence agencies to spies in the field, one-time pads that can't be traced or decrypted without the key. No government has ever officially acknowledged operating them, yet they continue broadcasting. You can tune in right now, tonight, and hear them yourself. Columns of numbers spoken by synthetic voices, meaningless to you, critical to someone somewhere. It's communication happening in plain sight that no one will explain. Which brings us to a man who communicated by simply walking the same path for 32 years. The Leatherman. Here's the thing about the Leatherman. He kept the most precise schedule of any person in New England for over 30 years, and no one ever learned his name. From 1857 to 1889, an unidentified man dressed entirely in handmade leather clothing walked a 365-mile loop between the Connecticut and Hudson rivers. He completed the circuit every 34 days, keeping to a schedule so precise that townspeople could set their watches by his appearance. He slept in caves, accepted food from families along his route, and rarely spoke. When he did, it was in broken French. No one ever learned his name or where he came from. He died in 1889 in one of his caves. Attempts to identify him through records and grave exhumation have failed. The Leatherman remains exactly what he appeared to be, a man walking in circles for reasons he never shared, wearing silence like his leather suit. Speaking of mysteries embedded in public spaces, let's look down at the street. The Toynbee tiles. Here's the thing about the Toynbee tiles. Someone has been embedding mysterious messages into the pavement of major American cities for decades, and we still don't know who. Since the 1980s, mysterious tiles have appeared embedded in asphalt across major U.S. cities: Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., and others. The tiles are roughly the size of a license plate and contain variations of the same cryptic message. Toynbee idea in movie 2, 1001 Resurrect Dead on planet Jupiter. Hundreds have been discovered. They're made of linoleum and asphalt crack filler, professionally installed in the middle of busy streets. No one has definitively identified who places them, though independent documentarians have proposed theories. New tiles still appear occasionally, decades after the first ones were found. They're messages without a clear sender or recipient, scattered across American pavement like breadcrumbs from someone trying to tell us something we don't understand. And if you think that's geographically strange, wait until you hear about a triangle in Massachusetts, the Bridgewater Triangle. Here's the thing about the Bridgewater Triangle. The people who named it 300 years ago called it the place where spirits dwell, and the reports haven't stopped since. In southeastern Massachusetts, there's a 200 square mile area that has generated reports of unexplained phenomena since the 1700s. The Bridgewater Triangle, as researchers call it, includes the Hockomock Swamp, a name the Wampanoag people gave it, meaning the place where spirits dwell. Within this zone, people have reported UFO sightings, giant snakes, mysterious creatures resembling Bigfoot, cattle mutilations, ghost sightings, and strange lights. The reports span centuries and come from unrelated witnesses. Skeptics attribute it to a combination of confirmation bias and the area's genuine geographic oddness. Swamps create unusual lights. Wildlife behaves strangely. But the sheer volume and consistency of reports is noteworthy. Something about that stretch of Massachusetts has made people uneasy for over 300 years. Though speaking of unease, let's visit a building where presidents themselves felt watched. President Taft and the White House ghost. Here's the thing about Lincoln's ghost. It's been reported by so many credible witnesses across so many different eras that it's become almost impossible to simply dismiss. Multiple presidents, staff members, and foreign dignitaries have reported seeing or feeling the presence of Abraham Lincoln's ghost in the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt said she felt his presence regularly. Winston Churchill claimed he saw Lincoln standing by a fireplace after stepping out of a bath. Churchill was reportedly naked at the time and said to the apparition, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands answered a knock at her bedroom door during a state visit and fainted after seeing Lincoln in the hallway. Harry Truman heard mysterious footsteps. Ronald Reagan's dog would bark at empty rooms. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the consistency of these reports across different people, different eras, and different cultural backgrounds is striking. Lincoln's presence seems to linger, though some presences are far less benign, as we'll see next. The LaLaurie Mansion. Here's the thing about the LaLaurie Mansion. The real horror has nothing to do with ghosts. In 1834, a fire broke out in Madame Delphine LaLaurie's mansion in New Orleans. When neighbors rushed to help, they discovered enslaved people chained in the attic under conditions so horrific that even in the antebellum South, it caused outrage. There was evidence of prolonged cruelty and suffering. Madame Lalaurie fled to Paris before she could be prosecuted. She was never held accountable. The mansion still stands in the French Quarter. It's been a school, an apartment building, a furniture store, and a private residence. Every owner has reported strange occurrences: voices, footsteps, figures in mirrors. Ghost tour companies stop there nightly. But the real horror isn't supernatural. It's the documented cruelty that happened there, committed by a wealthy socialite who escaped justice by boarding a ship. History doesn't always punish the guilty. Sometimes it just remembers them. Speaking of things the government would rather forget, let's talk about mind control, Project MKUltra. Here's the thing about MKUltra. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a documented CIA program, and most of its files were deliberately destroyed. From 1953 to 1973, the CIA conducted secret experiments on American citizens without their knowledge or consent. The project was called MKUltra, and its goal was to develop techniques for mind control and interrogation. Methods included administering LSD to unwitting subjects, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, hypnosis, and other psychological manipulation. The program's director, Richard Helms, ordered most of the files destroyed in 1973 when the program was shut down. What survived was declassified in 1977 after a Freedom of Information Act request. We know MKUltra happened. We know it violated every ethical standard. We'll never know the full extent because the evidence was deliberately destroyed. Some test subjects died. Others were permanently damaged. None of them consented. It's a reminder that classified sometimes means criminal. And speaking of crimes that shocked the nation, let's visit a small town in Iowa. The Villisca Axe murders. Here's the thing about the Villisca Axe murders. 8 people were killed in their beds, 6 of them children, and the case was never solved. On the night of June 9th, 1912, someone entered the Moore House in Villisca, Iowa, and murdered all 8 occupants with an axe while they slept. The killer covered all the mirrors in the house with cloth and left a bowl of bloody water by the door. Despite a lengthy investigation, multiple suspects, and even a trial, no one was ever convicted. The house still stands. It operates as a museum now, and yes, you can spend the night there if you're so inclined. Visitors report hearing children's voices, seeing shadows, feeling sudden cold. But the real horror isn't paranormal. It's the unsolved brutality of the crime itself. 8 people, including children, killed in their beds, and we still don't know who did it or why. Speaking of unknowns that haunt the living, let's float over to an island. The Island of the Dolls. Here's the thing about the Island of the Dolls. It started as one man's grief and became one of the most disturbing places on Earth. A man named Don Julian Santana Barrera lived alone on a small island near Mexico City and claimed he was being haunted by the spirit of a girl who had drowned nearby. To appease her, he began hanging dolls from the trees, hundreds of them in various states of decay. Missing eyes, cracked faces, limbs dangling. The island became a grotesque shrine. Tourists began visiting, bringing more dolls. Julian was found dead in 2001 in the same spot where he claimed the girl had drowned. The dolls still hang there, weathered and watching. It's a place where grief twisted into obsession, and obsession became a tourist attraction, which is oddly fitting, Chait, because America has always had a complicated relationship with displaying the dead. Speaking of which, let's go further back in time. Cahokia's sacrifice pits. Here's the thing about Cahokia. At its peak, it was larger than London, and it practiced human sacrifice on a scale that still shocks archaeologists. Near modern-day St. Louis, there once stood a city called Cahokia. At its peak around 1100 AD, it had a larger population than London. The Mississippian people who built it constructed enormous earthen mounds, some over 100 feet tall. They were sophisticated, organized, powerful. They also practiced human sacrifice. Archaeologists have discovered mass burial pits containing the remains of over 270 people. One pit held 53 young women, buried together in a ceremonial mound. The evidence suggests these were ritual killings, not battle casualties. Cahokia was abandoned by 1300 AD for reasons still debated: environmental collapse, political upheaval, disease. The mounds remain. You can visit them, stand on top of Monk's Mound, and look out over the floodplain where thousands once lived, worked, and died in ways we're still trying to understand. And speaking of things we're trying to understand, let's open a box. The Dybbuk box. Here's the thing about the Dybbuk box. Every single person who has owned it has reported the same kinds of disturbances, and none of them knew each other. In 2001, a wine cabinet was purchased at an estate sale in Portland, Oregon. The previous owner's granddaughter warned the buyer not to open it, claiming it contained a Dybbuk, a malicious spirit from Jewish folklore. The buyer opened it anyway. Inside were strange items: locks of hair, a dried rosebud, a candlestick, and a granite slab engraved with the Hebrew word for shalom. He later reported nightmares, health problems, and a pervasive smell of cat urine with no source. He sold it on eBay. The next owner experienced similar phenomena and sold it again. The box changed hands multiple times, each owner reporting disturbances. It's now displayed in Zach Bagans' Haunted Museum in Las Vegas, sealed in a glass case. Whether cursed or not, the Dybbuk box has become a modern legend, a cautionary tale about opening things meant to stay closed. Speaking of things that should have stayed closed, let's talk about presidential curses. The curse of Tippecanoe. Here's the thing about the curse of Tippecanoe. For over 100 years, being elected president in a year ending in 0 was statistically fatal. Starting with William Henry Harrison in 1840, every president elected in a year ending in 0 died in office. Harrison died after 1 month. Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860, was assassinated. James Garfield, elected in 1880, was assassinated. William McKinley, elected in 1900, was assassinated. Warren G. Harding, elected in 1920, died of a heart attack. Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected in 1940, died in office. John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, was assassinated. The pattern held for 120 years. It's called the Curse of Tippecanoe, named after Harrison's military victory. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, survived an assassination attempt and broke the curse. Whether coincidence or pattern, the fact remains. For over a century, being elected president in a 0 year was statistically fatal. Which brings us to an experiment that was allegedly even stranger. The Philadelphia experiment. Here's the thing about the Philadelphia experiment. It's almost certainly a hoax, but it's a hoax so detailed and persistent that it has never fully died. In October of 1943, the USS Eldridge was supposedly subjected to a secret Navy experiment in Philadelphia Harbor. According to the legend, the goal was to render the ship invisible to radar. Instead, the ship allegedly became completely invisible to the naked eye, teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, then reappeared in Philadelphia. Crew members were reportedly fused into the ship's metal structure. The Navy has consistently denied the experiment ever occurred. No credible evidence supports it. Sailors who served on the Eldridge during that period reported nothing unusual. Yet the story persists, fueled by a series of letters sent to a UFO researcher in the 1950s by a man using the name Carlos Allende. It's likely a hoax, but it's a hoax that won't die. Perhaps because people want to believe the government is capable of secrets that strange. Speaking of strange sightings, let's fly to West Virginia. The Mothman. Here's the thing about the Mothman. Over 100 people reported seeing it, and then the Silver Bridge collapsed. Between 1966 and 1967, over 100 residents of Point Pleasant, West Virginia reported seeing a creature unlike anything in nature. Descriptions were consistent: 7 feet tall, humanoid, with enormous wings and glowing red eyes. It was seen flying, standing in fields, perched on buildings. Sightings stopped abruptly on December 15th, 1967, when the Silver Bridge collapsed during rush hour, killing 46 people. Some believe the Mothman was a warning. Others think it was mass hysteria. Ornithologists suggested a sandhill crane, though that doesn't explain the consistency of reports or the timing. The town has embraced the legend. There's a Mothman statue, a Mothman museum, an annual Mothman festival. But in 1967, people were genuinely terrified. They saw something. Whether creature, omen, or shared delusion, it left a mark on the town that remains. And speaking of things that remain underground, let's dig beneath a city. America's catacombs. Here's the thing about Indianapolis. Beneath its streets, there's a forgotten shadow city that most residents have no idea exists. Beneath Indianapolis, there's an abandoned network of underground tunnels stretching for miles. They were built in the late 1800s as part of a centralized steam heating system, delivering heat from a coal-fired plant to downtown buildings. The system was sealed in the 1950s when it became obsolete. The tunnels remain mostly unmapped and largely forgotten. Urban explorers who ventured inside report strange acoustics, unexplained cold spots, and an oppressive atmosphere. Some tunnels are partially flooded. Others are pristine, as if workers just left for lunch and never returned. It's a shadow city beneath the city, a monument to infrastructure that outlived its purpose. Most people walking the streets above have no idea it's there, which is somewhat comforting. Because if you knew what was underneath, you might not want to walk there. Speaking of walking into disaster, let's head to the mountains. The Donner Party's last meal. Here's the thing about the Donner Party. For generations, the survivors denied what the forensic evidence would eventually confirm. In the winter of 1846 to 1847, the Donner Party became trapped by snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Supplies ran out. People began dying. Survivors faced an impossible choice. For years, they denied what happened next. But archaeological analysis of the campsite found bone fragments with human teeth marks and cut marks consistent with butchering. The forensic evidence confirmed what survivors spent the rest of their lives trying to forget. Desperation erases taboos. The Donner Party weren't monsters. They were people pushed past the edge of survival. The bones don't lie, even when the survivors did. It's one of the darkest chapters of westward expansion, a reminder that Manifest Destiny had a body count we don't always talk about. And speaking of bodies we don't talk about, let's visit a house built on the wrong spot. The Whaley House Poltergeist. Here's the thing about the Whaley House. It was built on the site of a public execution, and the man who was hanged there apparently never left. The Whaley House in San Diego was built in 1857 on the site of a public gallows where a man named Yankee Jim Robinson had been hanged years earlier. From the beginning, residents reported unexplained footsteps, doorknobs turning on their own, and the apparition of a man in the upstairs hallway. The house has been investigated by nearly every major paranormal research organization in America. It's been featured in documentaries, books, and television shows. The U.S. Department of Commerce once officially designated it as haunted, though that designation was later rescinded. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the Whaley House has the rare distinction of having consistent, documented reports spanning over a century and a half. Footsteps are still heard, Doors still move, and Yankee Jim, if he's there, hasn't left. Speaking of people who haven't left, let's return to H. Holmes one last time. H. Holmes's confession letter. Here's the thing about Holmes's confession letter. Even at the very end, it's impossible to know whether he was being honest or running one final con. Before his execution in 1896, H. Holmes wrote a confession that remains chilling in its self-awareness. He stated, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer. No more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." It's the kind of line that makes you wonder if he was being honest or performing one last manipulation. Holmes also requested that his coffin be filled with cement and buried 10 feet deep so no one could steal his body for medical experiments, a fate he'd inflicted on his own victims. His request was granted, and he's buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in Philadelphia, entombed in cement, just as he asked. Even in death, Holmes controlled the narrative. Which brings us to a place where narrative and legend have completely merged. The Stull Cemetery. Here's the thing about Stull Cemetery in Kansas. It's a completely unremarkable graveyard that somehow became known as one of the 7 gateways to hell. Stull Cemetery in Kansas has been called one of the 7 gateways to hell. The legend claims that the devil himself appears there twice a year, on Halloween and the spring equinox. In 1999, a story circulated that Pope John Paul II had his plane rerouted to avoid flying over the cemetery. The Vatican has never confirmed or denied this, and no flight records support it. The cemetery is real. The legends are persistent. But the actual evidence is thin. It's a small, unremarkable graveyard in rural Kansas that somehow became a focal point for occult folklore. Trespassers have caused so much damage over the years that the ruins of the old church were demolished and the property is now heavily monitored. It's a case study in how legends grow. Someone tells a story, it spreads, and eventually the place becomes what people believe it to be. Speaking of beliefs that spread, let's talk about a government program that was very real. The US government tested bioweapons on cities. Here's the thing about Operation Sea Spray. The US Navy sprayed bacteria over San Francisco. 800,000 people breathed it in, and none of them were ever told. In September of 1950, the US Navy conducted Operation Sea Spray over San Francisco. Without informing the public, they sprayed bacteria called Serratia marcescens over the city from ships in the bay. The goal was to simulate a biological attack and study how pathogens would spread through an urban population. 800,000 residents were exposed. At least one person, Edward Nevin, died from a resulting infection. 11 others became seriously ill. The Navy didn't reveal the test until 1977, when documents were declassified. Residents had no idea they'd been part of an experiment. They breathed in bacteria released by their own government, trusting the air was safe. It's a violation that's hard to comprehend. Your own military treating your city as a laboratory. And speaking of laboratories no one knew about, let's board a ship that never left port. Cho, the haunting of the USS Hornet. Here's the thing about the USS Hornet. Over 300 men died aboard it, and some say none of them have left. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet served in World War II and the Vietnam War before being decommissioned and turned into a museum in Alameda, California. Over 300 men died aboard the ship during its service. Since becoming a museum, night watchmen and visitors have reported tools moving on their own, doors slamming in sealed compartments, and full-body apparitions in the engine room. The ship is considered the most haunted vessel in the Navy. Paranormal investigation teams have recorded unexplained voices and temperature drops. Some former crew members refuse to visit, saying the ship still feels occupied. Whether it's the echoes of trauma, residual energy, or actual spirits, The USS Hornet carries the weight of everyone who served and died aboard. The ship is open for tours. You can walk the same corridors. Just know you might not be walking them alone. Speaking of walking alone, let's dig up the past. Literally. The resurrection of corpses for medical schools. Here's the thing about American medical education in the 1800s. It ran on stolen bodies, and everyone knew it. American medical schools faced a problem. They needed cadavers for anatomy classes, but there weren't enough legal bodies to meet demand. So they turned to grave robbers, known as resurrection men, who dug up fresh corpses and sold them to universities. The practice was so common that wealthy families installed mort safes, iron cages placed over graves to prevent theft. Some cemeteries hired armed guards. Medical students didn't ask where the bodies came from. Doctors didn't tell. It was an open secret that fueled medical education for decades. Eventually, laws changed to allow unclaimed bodies to be used for dissection, and the resurrection trade died out. But for years, being buried didn't mean you'd stay that way. Your body was valuable, and someone knew where you were. Speaking of people who disappeared, let's visit Vermont. The Bennington Triangle. Here's the thing about the Bennington Triangle. 5 people vanished without a trace in the same small area of Vermont over just 5 years, and not a single body was ever found. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 people vanished without a trace in a small area near Bennington, Vermont. The disappearances happened under different circumstances: a hiking trip, a walk home from work, a college outing, but all occurred within the same geographic zone near Glastonbury Mountain. Despite massive search efforts involving hundreds of volunteers, no bodies were ever found. The Abenaki people historically avoided the mountain, considering it cursed ground. Modern investigators have proposed theories: serial killer, wild animals, disorientation in dense forest. None fully explain why 5 people would disappear so completely in such a short time frame. The area is still remote, still forested, still quiet, and somewhere in those woods, there might be answers no one has found, though sometimes the answers are hiding in plain sight, like a clock that doesn't quite fit. Thomas Jefferson's clock. Here's the thing about Thomas Jefferson's clock at Monticello. It's a perfect piece of engineering that required cutting a hole in the floor to work. Thomas Jefferson designed many things for his Monticello estate, including an elaborate clock mechanism in the entrance hall. The clock tracks not only the time, but also the days of the week using cannonball weights on a pulley system. Each weight corresponds to a day. As the weights descend, they mark the passage of the week. There's just one problem. Jefferson miscalculated the ceiling height. The weights needed more space than the room allowed. His solution? He cut a hole in the floor. Saturday's weight hangs down into the basement. You can visit Monticello today and see it. This brilliant man's clock, functioning perfectly despite requiring a hole through the floor to work. It's a reminder that even geniuses make mistakes. They just make them in interesting ways. And speaking of interesting mistakes, let's turn to a crime that was never solved: the Black Dahlia. Here's the thing about the Black Dahlia. It's been over 75 years, and we still don't know who killed Elizabeth Short. On January 15th, 1947, the body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. Her body had been severed at the waist and drained of blood. Her face had been cut from the corners of her mouth toward her ears. The crime scene was so disturbing that even hardened detectives were shaken. The case became a media sensation. Elizabeth was given the nickname the Black Dahlia by newspapers. Despite one of the largest investigations in LAPD history, the killer was never identified. Over the decades, dozens of people confessed, but none were credible. Theories abound: a doctor, a revenge killing, a serial killer. The case remains open. Elizabeth Short's murder is a wound in Los Angeles history that never healed, a mystery that refuses to stay buried. Speaking of things that refuse to stay buried, let's talk about a cursed diamond. The curse of the Hope Diamond. Here's the thing about the Hope Diamond: its documented ownership history reads like a list of people who should have known better. The Hope Diamond is a 45-carat blue diamond now housed in the Smithsonian. According to legend, it was stolen from a Hindu idol in India and carries a curse. Previous owners supposedly suffered violent deaths, financial ruin, and madness. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette owned it. Both were beheaded. A later owner, Evelyn Walsh McLean, lost her son in a car accident, her daughter to an overdose, and her husband to a mental institution. When McLean died, her estate sold the diamond to jeweler Harry Winston. He donated it to the Smithsonian in 1958 via registered mail, insured for $1 million in a plain brown box. The mailman who delivered it was later hit by a truck and had his leg crushed. Whether cursed or coincidence, the Hope Diamond has an impressive body count. Speaking of impressive body counts, let's visit a religious community with unusual furniture. The Shakers' Death Furniture. Here's the thing about the Shakers: they didn't fear death, and their furniture proves it. The Shaker religious communities of New England practiced a form of Christianity that emphasized simplicity, celibacy, and separation from the world. They were also extremely practical about death. Shaker craftsmen made their own coffins as everyday furniture pieces. A coffin might serve as a storage chest, a bench, or a blanket box until it was needed for its ultimate purpose. Some communities reportedly kept empty coffins in hallways as reminders of mortality. The Shakers believed death was a natural transition, not something to fear or hide. So they lived with their coffins, literally. The furniture was beautifully made, functional, and patient. It's a level of acceptance most of us will never achieve, keeping the box you'll be buried in as a place to store quilts. Speaking of things stored away, let's dive into a lake. The ghost ship of the Great Lakes. Here's the thing about the Edmund Fitzgerald: 29 men are still aboard it, 530 feet below the surface of Lake Superior, and their families have fought to keep it that way. On November 10th, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior during a storm, taking all 29 crew members with her. The wreck lies in Canadian waters, 530 feet below the surface. Families of the deceased have repeatedly blocked salvage operations, wanting the site to remain undisturbed as a grave. Divers who have explored the wreck report seeing intact human remains visible through portholes. The ship is considered a tomb. Gordon Lightfoot's song, "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald," immortalized the tragedy. But the families live with the knowledge that their loved ones are still down there, still aboard, unreachable. The lake, they say, never gives up her dead. It's a haunting that doesn't require ghosts, just cold water and the absence of closure. Speaking of cold absences, let's open a book bound in something unsettling. Skin-bound books. Here's the thing about skin-bound books: Harvard's library held one for over a century, and visitors touched it without knowing what it was. Harvard's Houghton Library held a book bound in human skin until 2024, when the binding was removed following ethical review. The practice, called anthropodermic bibliophagy, was documented in 18th and 19th century America. Books were sometimes bound in the skin of executed criminals, unclaimed bodies, or even willing donors. One French anatomist bound books in the skin of patients who died in his care. The bindings were treated and tanned like leather. To the touch, they were indistinguishable from animal hide. Tests can now confirm the origin using peptide analysis. Harvard's book was bound in the skin of a woman who died in a hospital. No one knows if she consented. The book has been rebound in calfskin, but for over a century, library visitors touched human skin without knowing it. Speaking of things people touched without knowing, let's cross the border briefly. The Bell Island boom. Here's the thing about the Bell Island boom. It was powerful enough to trigger a US nuclear detection satellite, and no official explanation was ever given. On April 2nd, 1978, a massive unexplained explosion struck Bell Island, Newfoundland, near the US coast. The blast destroyed electrical equipment across the island. Television sets exploded, wiring melted. A US Vela satellite, designed to detect nuclear detonations, recorded an electromagnetic pulse consistent with a massive energy release. No crater was found. No military activity was reported. No explanation was ever officially provided. Theories ranged from secret weapons testing to atmospheric phenomena to meteor impact. Residents described a blinding flash and a sound like thunder, but magnified. Whatever happened on Bell Island that day released enough energy to trigger nuclear detection systems and remains unexplained nearly 50 years later. It's a reminder that some events defy easy categorization. And speaking of defying categorization, let's look at George Washington's teeth. George Washington's teeth. Here's the thing about George Washington's teeth. The wooden teeth story is a myth. The truth is considerably darker. Washington suffered from dental problems his entire adult life and wore multiple sets of dentures. They were made from a combination of materials: hippopotamus ivory, horse teeth, donkey teeth, and human teeth, some of which were purchased from enslaved people. In 1784, Washington's ledger records a payment to Negroes for 9 teeth. The dentures caused him constant pain and likely contributed to his famously stern expression in portraits. By the time he became president, he had only one natural tooth remaining. The dentures didn't fit well, affected his speech, and were held in place by metal springs. So, when you picture the father of our country, remember he was doing it while his mouth was in agony, held together by ivory and metal and the teeth of people who had no choice. Speaking of choices, let's walk into the woods. The Patterson-Gimlin film. Here's the thing about the Patterson-Gimlin film. It has never been definitively proven to be a hoax, and that fact keeps everyone up at night. On October 20th, 1967, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were riding horses in Northern California when they allegedly encountered a large bipedal creature. Patterson grabbed his camera and filmed 59 seconds of footage showing what appears to be a female Bigfoot walking near a creek bed. The creature turns and looks directly at the camera before disappearing into the forest. The Patterson-Gimlin film remains the most analyzed piece of Bigfoot evidence ever captured. Experts have studied the gait, the muscle movement, the proportions. Some declare it a hoax. Others say the biomechanics are too complex to fake with 1960s costume technology. Patterson died in 1972, insisting it was real. Gimlin maintains the same story today. The film has never been definitively proven to be a hoax, which means either they captured genuine footage of an unknown species, or they created the most enduring cryptozoological mystery in American history. Speaking of mysteries, let's deal some cards. Dead Man's Hand. Here's the thing about Dead Man's Hand. Wild Bill Hickok usually sat with his back to the wall. On August 2nd, 1876, he didn't. Wild Bill Hickok was playing poker in a saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota. He usually sat with his back to a wall, but that day all those seats were taken. He sat facing away from the door. A man named Jack McCall walked in and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok died instantly. When his body fell, his cards scattered across the table: 2 black aces and 2 black eights. The identity of the 5th card was never recorded, though some claim it was the 5 of diamonds. The hand became known as the Dead Man's Hand and is still considered unlucky by gamblers. Hickok's grave in Mount Moriah Cemetery remains one of the most visited sites in Deadwood. He was 39 years old, a legendary gunfighter killed while holding a pair of eights. Speaking of unlucky hands, let's open some letters. The Circleville Letters. Here's the thing about the Circleville Letters. They continued arriving even after the prime suspect was locked in prison. Starting in 1976, residents of Circleville, Ohio, began receiving anonymous letters revealing personal secrets and making threatening accusations. The letters were written in block handwriting and demonstrated detailed knowledge of people's private lives. One bus driver, Mary Gillespie, was harassed for years by letters accusing her of having an affair. Her husband received letters threatening violence. Booby-trap signs appeared on roads. One nearly killed Mary when she stopped to remove it, triggering a gun mechanism. A suspect, Paul Freshour, was eventually imprisoned for attempted murder related to the booby trap. But the letters continued even while he was in prison. They arrived sporadically for decades. Freshour maintained his innocence until his death in 2012. The true author of the Circleville letters was never definitively identified. Someone in that small Ohio town knew everyone's secrets and spent decades making sure they knew it. Speaking of things people know, let's visit a museum. The Mutter Museum's Megacolon. Here's the thing about the Mutter Museum's Megacolon. A man carried this inside him, alive, for years. Philadelphia's Mutter Museum exists to educate medical professionals and the public about anatomy and medical anomalies. Among its collection is a preserved human colon that measured 8 feet long and weighed over 40 pounds at the time of the patient's death. The man who owned this colon suffered from Hirschsprung's disease, a condition where nerve cells are missing from the intestines, preventing normal muscle contractions. His colon expanded to accommodate the waste his body couldn't expel. He lived with this condition, carrying this enormous distended organ inside him, until it finally killed him. The megacolon is displayed in a glass case, a pale, preserved monument to suffering. It's educational, it's important, and it's deeply, profoundly uncomfortable to look at, which is somewhat the point. Speaking of uncomfortable points, let's drift toward the border, the zone of silence. Here's the thing about the zone of silence. The US military lost a missile there, and what happened next raises more questions than answers. Near the border between Mexico and the US, there's a remote area known as the Mapimi Silent Zone, or Zone of Silence. According to reports, radio signals fail, compass needles spin, and electronic devices malfunction within this region. In 1970, the US military lost an Athena missile there when it veered off course by hundreds of miles and crashed in the zone. The military launched a recovery operation and reportedly removed contaminated soil. Locals claim strange phenomena continue: meteor fragments, mutated wildlife, odd encounters. Scientific investigations have found higher than normal levels of magnetic minerals in the soil, which might explain compass issues. But that doesn't fully account for the missile going wildly off course or the persistent reports of electronic failure. It's a place where technology doesn't quite work the way it should. And speaking of things that don't work the way they should, let's visit an island. America's mass graves. Here's the thing about Hart Island. Over 1 million people are buried there in mass graves. And most of New York City has no idea it exists. Hart Island in New York City has served as a potter's field since 1869. Over 1 million unclaimed, unidentified, or indigent bodies are buried there in mass graves. For decades, burials were performed by prison labor from Rikers Island. Bodies arrive in simple pine boxes and are stacked in trenches, sometimes 3 coffins deep. Many are stillborn infants, homeless individuals, victims of epidemics. Some are people whose families couldn't afford burial elsewhere. Until recently, public access to the island was severely restricted. Families often didn't know their loved ones were buried there. The island is a silent memorial to everyone society forgot. A million people whose deaths went largely unmarked, buried in the shadow of one of the wealthiest cities on earth. It's a reminder that poverty follows you even after death. Speaking of what follows us, let's go underground again. The Salem tunnels. Here's the thing about the tunnels beneath Salem, Massachusetts. They're real, they're mostly unmapped, and they run beneath one of the most historically dark cities in America. Beneath Salem, Massachusetts, a network of tunnels built in the 1700s winds under the city. They were originally used for smuggling goods to avoid taxes and later for bootlegging during Prohibition. Some tunnels connect to buildings associated with the witch trials, though the trials themselves predated the tunnels by decades. Most of the network is sealed and unmapped. Urban explorers occasionally find entrances, but the tunnels are unstable, prone to flooding, and genuinely dangerous. The city discourages exploration, but the tunnels remain, a hidden layer beneath a city already famous for its dark history. Somewhere under the streets where tourists walk and shop, there are passages that have been dark for over a century. No one knows exactly where they all lead. And speaking of mysterious passages, let's cross the ocean one more time. Benjamin Franklin's basement bones. Here's the thing about Benjamin Franklin's London home. When workers renovated it in 1998, they found over 1,200 human bone fragments in the basement. The bones dated to Franklin's era and showed evidence of dissection and surgical practice. They belonged to multiple individuals of various ages. The most likely explanation is that Franklin's friend, William Hewson, ran an anatomy school in the house. Bodies were probably obtained through grave robbing, which was common for medical education at the time. Franklin likely knew about the school and may have even attended demonstrations. The bones were given a proper burial in 1998. But for over 2 centuries, they lay beneath the house where one of America's founding fathers lived, a secret literally buried under the floorboards. It's a reminder that even our heroes had shadows. And speaking of shadows, let's turn to a very famous exorcism. The Georgetown exorcism. Here's the thing about the real events behind The Exorcist. They were documented by attending priests, hospital staff, and medical personnel who all signed sworn statements. The real events behind the novel and film The Exorcist occurred in a Maryland suburb in 1949. A 14-year-old boy, Chawaz, known by the pseudonym Roland Doe, to protect his identity, underwent multiple exorcism rituals over several weeks. The case was documented by attending priests and hospital staff in meticulous detail, creating one of the most thoroughly recorded accounts of alleged demonic possession in American history. Reports included unexplained scratches appearing on the boy's body, forming words and symbols that witnesses photographed. Objects moved without physical contact. The boy exhibited violent reactions to religious items, holy water, crucifixes, blessed objects. He spoke in voices that didn't sound like his own, sometimes in languages he'd never studied. His bed shook, his body contorted. Several exorcisms were attempted at the family home before the decision was made to move him. The boy was eventually transferred to a hospital in St. Louis, where Jesuit priests performed the final ritual that reportedly ended the possession. Witnesses included multiple priests, family members, and medical personnel who signed statements describing what they'd observed. The Catholic Church never officially validated the case as genuine demonic possession, maintaining careful institutional distance, but the documentation exists. Diary entries, photographs, signed testimonies. The boy grew up, lived a completely normal life, married, had a career, and reportedly never spoke publicly about the events again. His identity remained protected until his death. The case influenced how the church approached exorcism requests and became the template for countless possession stories that followed. Speaking of possession, let's visit a family that didn't survive their encounter. The Bloody Benders. Here's the thing about the Bloody Benders. They were a family that murdered travelers together. and then they vanished completely and were never found. From 1871 to 1873, the Bender family ran an inn in southeastern Kansas along the Osage Trail. Travelers who stopped there sometimes disappeared. When neighbors became suspicious, the Benders vanished overnight. Investigating the property, authorities discovered 11 bodies buried near the inn. The victims had been killed in a similar manner, seated in a chair positioned against a canvas curtain that divided the room, then struck from behind while the family served them dinner. The Benders were never found. Despite a massive manhunt and numerous reported sightings across the country, they escaped justice completely. The inn was torn down, the property became farmland, but the Bender murders remain one of America's most notorious, unsolved serial killing cases. A family that murdered together, vanished together, and were never held accountable. Speaking of warnings no one heeded, let's walk along a beach. The Gray Man of Pawleys Island. Here's the thing about the Gray Man of Pawleys Island. People have been seeing him before hurricanes for over 200 years, and those who listen always seem to survive. For over 200 years, residents of Pawleys Island, South Carolina, have reported seeing a figure dressed in gray walking the beach before major hurricanes. The legend dates back to at least 1822. Those who encountered the Gray Man and heed his warning by evacuating reportedly return to find their homes untouched, even when neighboring properties are destroyed. Before Hurricane Hazel in 1954, several residents reported seeing him. Those who left were spared. Before Hurricane Hugo in 1989, he was seen again. The pattern has repeated through multiple storms. Skeptics dismiss it as coincidence and confirmation bias. Believers say the Gray Man is a protective spirit, perhaps a man who died in a hurricane centuries ago and now warns the living. Either way, people still report seeing him. And when they do, they pack their bags and leave. Speaking of leaving, let's talk about something that should have stayed sealed. The US government opened mail for 20 years. Here's the thing about the Age-Lingual program. The CIA illegally opened over 200,000 pieces of private mail for 20 years, and no one was ever prosecuted. From 1952 to 1973, the CIA conducted a program called Ht-Lingual that illegally opened and photographed over 215,000 pieces of first-class mail sent between the United States and the Soviet Union. They did this without warrants, without notification, and without legal authority. Mail from senators, journalists, celebrities, and ordinary citizens was intercepted, opened, photographed, and resealed. The program violated federal law and the Fourth Amendment. It was exposed during the Church Committee investigations in the 1970s. No one was prosecuted. The program simply ended when it was discovered. Your grandmother's letter to a pen pal in Moscow might have been photographed by the CIA. Your college professor's academic correspondence opened and cataloged, all without anyone knowing until decades later. Speaking of things discovered decades later, let's meet a frontiersman with an unusual diet. The liver-eating Johnson. Here's the thing about liver-eating Johnson. His reputation was so fearsome that the very people he was hunting eventually adopted him into their tribe. John Garrison Johnston was a mountain man and frontiersman who became known as Liver-Eating Johnson after his wife, who was a member of the Flathead tribe, was killed by Crow warriors in the 1840s. Johnston allegedly swore revenge and spent the next 25 years hunting Crow warriors. Legend says he killed and ate the livers of over 300 men during his vendetta. The stories were likely exaggerated, but Johnston's reputation was real enough that the Crow Nation eventually made peace with him and adopted him into the tribe out of respect for his tenacity. He later became a sheriff and died peacefully in 1900. Whether he actually ate livers or whether the nickname came from tall tales told around campfires, Johnston lived a life violent enough that people believed the stories, And in the Old West, reputation was reality. Speaking of reputations, let's visit a woman whose trial shocked a nation. Lizzie Borden's acquittal. Here's the thing about Lizzie Borden. She was acquitted, and someone in that house killed two people with a hatchet. On August 4th, 1892, Andrew and Abby Borden were killed with a hatchet in their Fall River, Massachusetts home. Andrew's daughter, Lizzie, was arrested and tried for the murders. The evidence was circumstantial but substantial. She was in the house. She gave conflicting statements. She'd tried to buy poison days before, but the jury acquitted her. Some historians believe they couldn't accept that a woman from a respectable family could commit such violence. Others point to legitimate, reasonable doubt. Lizzie lived in Fall River for the rest of her life, wealthy from her inheritance, socially isolated. She died in 1927. The house is now a bed and breakfast where guests can sleep in the room where Abby died. Every August, actors recreate the crime. The question of Lizzie's guilt remains debated, but someone killed Andrew and Abby Borden with a hatchet that morning, and that person was never conclusively identified. Speaking of people never identified, so let's visit America's oldest mystery, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony. Here's the thing about the lost colony of Roanoke. 117 people vanished without a trace, and after 400 years, we still don't know what happened to them. In 1587, 117 English colonists settled on Roanoke Island in what is now North Carolina. 3 years later, when the supply ship returned, the entire colony had vanished. Houses stood empty. Possessions were left behind. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a fence post and CRO carved into a tree. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island and a friendly local tribe. The supply ship's captain refused to investigate further due to bad weather. The colonists were never found. No bodies, no graves, no definitive evidence of their fate. Theories include assimilation with local tribes, death by disease or starvation, relocation, or attack. Archaeological evidence suggests some may have traveled inland. But after over 400 years, the lost colony remains lost. It's America's first and oldest unsolved disappearance. Speaking of disappearances, let's talk about a car that vanished piece by piece. The curse of James Dean's car. Here's the thing about James Dean's Porsche. Every piece of it that was sold to someone else seemed to bring disaster, and then the car itself vanished entirely. James Dean died on September 30th, 1955, when his Porsche 550 Spyder crashed on a California highway. After the wreck, the car was purchased by George Barris, a car customizer. Barris sold parts to other racing enthusiasts. Two men bought the engine and transmission for their race cars. Both cars crashed. One driver was killed. The other was seriously injured. The Porsche's shell was being displayed at a car show when it fell and broke a teenager's hip. A truck transporting the chassis was involved in an accident that killed the driver. In 1960, while being transported by train to a safety exhibition, the car's remains vanished. They've never been found. Whether the curse was real or just a series of tragic coincidences surrounding a famous death, James Dean's Spyder became legend. And somewhere, maybe, it still exists. Speaking of legends that still exist, let's follow a light down a railroad track. The Mako light. Here's the thing about the Mako light. Hundreds of people reported seeing it for over a century. And then the railroad tracks were removed and it stopped completely. For over a century, witnesses reported seeing a mysterious light along the railroad tracks near Mako Station, North Carolina. The light would appear at night, swinging back and forth as if someone were carrying a lantern. According to legend, it was the ghost of a conductor named Joe Baldwin who was decapitated in an 1867 train accident. The story says he searches the tracks with his lantern, looking for his missing head. Hundreds of people reported seeing the light Over the years, investigations found no natural explanation. The light appeared regularly, predictably, documented by locals and visitors alike. Then in 1977, the railroad tracks were removed. The light stopped appearing. No tracks, no light. Whether it was Joe Baldwin's ghost or some atmospheric phenomenon connected to the rails, the Mako light became one of the most witnessed paranormal events in North Carolina history. Speaking of witnessed events, let's talk about a poisoning that everyone ignored. America's largest mass poisoning. Here's the thing about leaded gasoline. The plant that produced it was nicknamed the Looney Gas Building. Workers died, and it stayed legal for another 70 years. In the 1920s, Standard Oil developed tetraethyl lead as a gasoline additive to reduce engine knock. Production took place at a plant in Elizabeth, New Jersey, nicknamed the Looney Gas Building by workers who noticed the mental effects. In October of 1924, 5 workers died and 35 were hospitalized with severe neurological damage. Workers experienced hallucinations, convulsions, and violent outbursts. Some attacked co-workers, others walked off roofs, seeing things that weren't there. The plant temporarily closed, then reopened. Leaded gasoline remained legal and widely used until 1996, despite decades of evidence showing it caused brain damage, especially in children. Millions of Americans were exposed. The effects were generational. It was mass poisoning in slow motion, prioritizing corporate profit over public health. The workers at the Looney Gas Building were just the first visible casualties. Speaking of visible casualties, let's look at faces that appeared where they shouldn't. The faces in the floor. Here's the thing about the faces in the floor. They kept coming back even after the family tore up the concrete and poured a completely new floor. That's right. In 1971, in Belmez de la Moraleda, Spain, faces reportedly began appearing in the concrete floor of a family's home. The story received extensive coverage in American media and inspired reports of similar phenomena in U.S. homes. The family tore up the floor and poured new concrete. The faces returned. Investigators photographed the faces. Some claimed fraud, suggesting the family painted them. Others found no evidence of artificial creation. The faces continued appearing for decades. Similar reports emerged from houses across America, faces in floor tiles, in wood grain, in plaster. Most were dismissed as pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. But the consistency of the Belmez case and the media attention it received made faces in the floor a genuine phenomenon, whether paranormal or psychological. Speaking of psychological phenomena, let's talk about surviving the impossible. Presidential near misses. Here's the thing about presidential assassination attempts. There have been at least 40 of them, and some came so close to succeeding that American history would look completely different if they had. At least 40 known assassination attempts have been made against U.S. presidents throughout history. Some came terrifyingly close to succeeding. In 1835, Andrew Jackson was approached by Richard Lawrence, who fired 2 pistols at point-blank range. Both misfired. Jackson beat him with his cane. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt was shot in the chest while campaigning in Milwaukee. The bullet was slowed by his eyeglass case and a folded speech in his pocket. Roosevelt proceeded to deliver his 90-minute speech with a bullet lodged in his chest, telling the crowd, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He survived. Gerald Ford survived 2 assassination attempts in the same month in 1975. The presidency is the most dangerous job in American politics. 4 presidents were assassinated. Many more would have been if not for misfires, faulty aim, or pure luck. Speaking of luck running out, let's unwrap a mummy. The Catskill mummy. Here's the thing about the Catskill mummy. When workers found him walled inside a building during renovations in 1871, there were scratch marks on the inside of the wall. Workers renovating a building in Catskill, New York, discovered the mummified body of a man dressed in colonial era clothing. The body appeared to have been walled in alive. There were scratch marks on the inside of the wall. His identity was never determined. No missing person reports matched. No records explained how or why someone would be sealed inside a wall. The body was naturally mummified due to the dry conditions inside the sealed space. Some theories suggested punishment for a crime, a murder covered up, or even voluntary entombment by someone with unusual religious beliefs. The mummy was eventually buried in a local cemetery, but the mystery of who he was and why he died in a wall remains unsolved. Speaking of walls that killed people, let's drink something that glowed. The radium craze. Here's the thing about the radium craze. People were voluntarily drinking radioactive water as a health tonic, and it destroyed them from the inside out. In the early 1900s, radium was marketed as a miracle substance. Companies added it to toothpaste, face creams, and drinking water. Radithor was a popular health tonic, distilled water with radium dissolved in it, sold as a cure for impotence, fatigue, and various ailments. Wealthy industrialist Eben Byers drank approximately 1,400 bottles between 1927 and 1931. The radium destroyed his bones from the inside. His jaw literally fell apart and had to be surgically removed. He died in 1932 in excruciating pain. The Wall Street Journal ran the headline, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off." His death helped end the radium health craze. But thousands had already consumed radioactive products into believing they were improving their health while actually poisoning themselves atom by atom. Speaking of poisoning, let's board a ship where everyone died screaming. The SS Orang Medan. Here's the thing about the SS Orang Medan. The entire crew was found dead with expressions of absolute terror on their faces, with no visible injuries. And then the ship exploded and sank before anyone could figure out what happened. In February of 1947, multiple ships in the Strait of Malacca received distress calls from the Dutch cargo ship SS Orang Medan. The messages were frantic and broken, ending with, "All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. Then, I die." A rescue ship reached the Orang Medan and found the entire crew dead. Bodies were discovered throughout the ship, faces frozen in expressions of terror, arms outstretched, mouths open. There were no visible injuries. Before investigators could examine the ship further, it caught fire and exploded, then sank. No explanation was ever confirmed. Theories include carbon monoxide poisoning, chemical cargo leak, or even cover-up of illegal weapons transport. The crew died terrified, and the evidence sank with them. The case remains one of maritime history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Speaking of mysteries involving the ground, let's visit a circle where nothing grows. The Devil's Tramping Ground. Here's the thing about the Devil's Tramping Ground in North Carolina. Nothing has grown in that circle for as long as anyone can remember, and soil science can't fully explain it. In Chatham County, North Carolina, there's a perfectly circular patch of barren ground, roughly 40 feet in diameter. Nothing has grown there for as long as anyone can remember. Local legend says the devil paces in circles there at night, and his footsteps have scorched the earth. Objects placed inside the circle are reportedly found moved outside it by morning. Soil analysis has been conducted multiple times. The soil is slightly more saline than surrounding areas, but not enough to explain complete barrenness. Seeds planted there fail to germinate. Grass won't take root. The scientific explanations are inconclusive. The folklore explanation is that it's the devil's stomping ground, and he doesn't want company. Either way, the circle remains bare, a perfectly round absence in the middle of a forest. And speaking of absences, let's talk about signals before disaster with the Lick Observatory's seismograph anomaly. Here's the thing about the Lick Observatory's seismograph readings from 1906. Hours before the San Francisco earthquake, the instruments detected something that scientists still can't explain. In April of 1906, the seismograph at Lick Observatory in California detected unusual seismic signals hours before the catastrophic San Francisco earthquake struck. The signals didn't match typical earthquake precursor patterns. They appeared, intensified, then stopped just before the main event. After the earthquake, scientists reviewed the data but couldn't identify the source of the pre-quake signals. Similar anomalous readings have been reported before other major earthquakes, but no reliable predictive pattern has been established. The Lick Observatory readings suggest there may be detectable warning signs before massive earthquakes, but we don't yet understand what we're measuring. Somewhere in the noise of the Earth's movements, there might be a warning system we haven't learned to read. Speaking of warnings, let's drive down a highway at night. America's haunted highways. Here's the thing about phantom hitchhikers. They've been reported on American highways for decades, and the descriptions are remarkably consistent across states and witnesses who've never heard of each other's experiences. Since the invention of the automobile, drivers across America have reported encounters with phantom hitchhikers, figures who appear on roadsides, accept rides, then vanish from moving vehicles. The most famous is the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 44 in Massachusetts. Witnesses describe a red-haired man who appears in headlights, thumbs extended. Drivers who stop find him gone. Those who don't stop sometimes see him in their rearview mirrors, standing in the road where collision should have been inevitable. Similar stories emerge from highways nationwide. A woman in white on Route 66, a soldier on Route 95, a child on rural roads in Texas. The details vary, but the pattern holds. A figure appears, then impossibly disappears. Whether shared cultural narrative or genuine phenomenon, the phantom hitchhiker has become a permanent passenger in American folklore. Speaking of permanent fixtures, let's talk about presidential secrets. The President's Book of Secrets. Here's the thing about the letters outgoing presidents leave for their successors. They're private, classified, and represent one of the few genuinely sacred traditions in American politics. Whether or not a literal President's Book of Secrets exists as depicted in popular culture, it's documented that outgoing presidents write private letters to their successors. These letters are left in the Oval Office desk and opened on Inauguration Day. The contents are classified and known only to the sender and recipient. George H.W. Bush's letter to Bill Clinton has been partially released. Ronald Reagan's letter to George H.W. Bush included personal advice and encouragement. Barack Obama's letter to Donald Trump remains private. The tradition represents continuity of office beyond political parties. Wisdom passed from one leader to the next, meant only for those who have carried the weight of the presidency. It's one of the few genuinely sacred traditions in American politics, a private conversation between people who share an experience almost no one else can understand. Speaking of experiences no one understands, let's visit an abandoned village. The Dudleytown Curse. Here's the thing about Dudleytown, Connecticut. It was a functioning village that was completely abandoned after a series of deaths, disappearances, and reported demonic activity, and the forest has swallowed it whole. Dudleytown, Connecticut was a small village settled in the 1700s. By the late 1800s, it was completely abandoned, following a series of deaths, disappearances, and reported supernatural occurrences. Residents claimed to experience demonic activity, madness, and misfortune. The forest has since reclaimed the village. Foundations and stone walls remain, but the buildings are gone. The area is now owned by a private foundation called Dark Entry Forest Association, which prohibits trespassing. Those who ignore the warnings and explore anyway report disorientation, equipment malfunctions, and an oppressive atmosphere. Whether the curse was real or whether the village simply failed due to poor farming conditions and isolation, Dudleytown became synonymous with abandonment and dread. The forest keeps its secrets. The foundation keeps people out. And somewhere under the trees, the ruins wait. Speaking of waiting, let's talk about a body that toured America, John Wilkes Booth's Mummy Tour. Here's the thing about John Wilkes Booth's Mummy Tour. A traveling carnival displayed what it claimed was Lincoln's assassin for years, and crowds paid to see it. After John Wilkes Booth was killed following Lincoln's assassination, persistent rumors claimed the wrong man had been shot. The body was buried in an unmarked grave. In the early 1900s, a mummified corpse alleged to be the real John Wilkes Booth began appearing in carnival sideshows across the South. The mummy's handler claimed Booth had escaped and lived under an assumed name until his death. The mummy was displayed for years, drawing crowds who paid to see Lincoln's assassin. No definitive proof was offered. No DNA testing was performed. Booth's official grave has never been exhumed for comparison. The mummy eventually disappeared from historical record. Whether genuine or an elaborate hoax, people wanted to believe Booth had escaped justice, that the man who killed Lincoln had gotten away. Sometimes the lie is more appealing than the truth. Speaking of appealing lies, let's visit a ranch. The Skinwalker Ranch. Here's the thing about Skinwalker Ranch. The U.S. government's Defense Intelligence Agency studied it as part of an official program, and whatever they found hasn't been made fully public. A 512-acre ranch in northeastern Utah has been the site of reported UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, poltergeist activity, and sightings of creatures that don't match any known species since at least the 1950s. The Sherman family, who owned the ranch in the 1990s, reported phenomena so frequent and disturbing they eventually sold the property. Subsequent owners included billionaire Robert Bigelow, who funded scientific investigation of the site. The U.S. government's Defense Intelligence Agency reportedly studied the ranch as part of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Researchers have documented electromagnetic anomalies, unexplained radiation, and equipment malfunctions. Whether the ranch is genuinely a nexus of paranormal activity or simply a place where expectation creates experience, it has attracted serious scientific and governmental attention. Something happens there. What it is remains genuinely unclear. Speaking of unclear phenomena, let's dig up some vampires. Colonial vampire panics. Here's the thing about the colonial vampire panics. These weren't superstitious villagers in a foreign country. These were educated Americans, doing this into the 1890s. In the 1700s and 1800s, New England communities regularly exhumed the bodies of tuberculosis victims, believing they were vampires draining the life from surviving family members. The practice was based on folk belief imported from Europe. When multiple family members died of consumption, what we now know as tuberculosis, communities would dig up the deceased and examine the bodies. If a corpse appeared too fresh, or if liquid blood was found in the heart, the body would be decapitated, the heart removed and burned, and the ashes sometimes fed to sick relatives as a cure. The practice continued into the 1890s. Mercy Brown's exhumation in 1892 was one of the last documented cases. These weren't ignorant peasants. These were educated Americans performing ritual desecration based on disease they didn't understand. Our fear makes people do terrible things. Speaking of terrible things, let's build a dam. The Hoover Dam bodies. Here's the thing about the Hoover Dam. The popular legend that bodies are entombed in the concrete isn't true, but the real story is somehow more eerie. The construction of Hoover Dam between 1931 and 1936 was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American history. 96 workers died during construction, from falls, equipment accidents, heat stroke, and other industrial hazards. Contrary to popular legend, no bodies are actually entombed in the concrete. The dam was poured in small sections, each carefully inspected before the next layer was added. If a worker had fallen into wet concrete, construction would have stopped until the body was recovered. But there is one genuinely eerie coincidence that no one can explain. The first person to die on the project was G. Tierney, a surveyor who drowned on December 20th, 1922, during preliminary work. The last person to die during construction was Patrick Tierney, J.G.'s son, who fell from an intake tower on December 20th, 1935, exactly 13 years apart to the day. Father and son killed by the same project on the same date. The Hoover Dam stands as a monument to American engineering, but it's also a graveyard where 96 men gave their lives, and two of them were connected by blood and by an impossible calendar coincidence that still defies explanation. Speaking of defying explanation, let's cross the ocean briefly one more time. Are the moving coffins of Barbados. Here's the thing about the moving coffins of Barbados. The vault was sealed with the governor's personal seal, and when it was reopened, the coffins had still moved. While technically not American history, the case of the Chase Vault in Barbados was extensively reported in American newspapers in the 1800s and became part of American popular culture. Between 1812 and 1820, a family vault in the Christchurch Cemetery repeatedly had its lead coffins found rearranged and overturned, despite being sealed with cement and marble. Each time the vault was opened for a new burial, the heavy coffins had been moved, sometimes thrown across the chamber. No evidence of entry was ever found. The vault was eventually examined by the governor of Barbados, Lord Combermere, who ordered it sealed with his personal seal. When reopened later, the coffins had again been disturbed, but the seal remained intact. The vault was finally abandoned and the coffins were buried elsewhere. No natural explanation, flooding, earthquake, vandalism, adequately explains the evidence. It remains one of history's most thoroughly documented cases of unexplained phenomena, and it captivated American audiences for decades, appearing in newspapers, books, and eventually inspiring similar tales across the United States. Speaking of tales that inspired terror, let's wade into a Louisiana swamp, the Manchac Swamp. Here's the thing about the Manchac Swamp. A voodoo priestess reportedly promised to take the whole town with her when she died, and on the day of her funeral, a hurricane erased the town from the map. So, the Manchac Swamp in Louisiana carries a reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. The legend centers on Julia Brown, a voodoo priestess who lived near the town of Frenier in the early 1900s. According to local accounts, she would sit on her porch singing, "One day I'm gonna die, and I'm gonna take the whole town with me." On September 29th, 1915, Julia Brown died. Her funeral was held during a massive hurricane that struck the Gulf Coast. The storm destroyed the entire town of Frenier and killed 3 residents. The town was never rebuilt. Today, the swamp is dense, dark, and eerily quiet. Fishermen and tour guides report strange lights, voices calling from the trees, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. Whether Julia Brown actually cursed the town or whether a hurricane simply coincided with her death, the swamp earned its haunted reputation. The ruins of Frenier lie somewhere beneath the water and vegetation, a town erased by a storm that arrived on the day of a voodoo priestess's funeral. Coincidence doesn't quite cover it. And speaking of coincidences that don't quite add up, let's visit Germany for a case that influenced American crime culture. The Hinterkaifeck murders. Here's the thing about the Hinterkaifeck murders. After killing an entire family, the killer stayed on the farm for several days, feeding the livestock and eating in the kitchen, and was never caught. In March of 1922, an entire family was murdered on an isolated farm in Germany called Hinterkaifeck. While this case occurred in Europe, it profoundly influenced American true crime culture and methodology. The 6 victims were killed with a farming tool. The truly disturbing detail: evidence suggests the killer remained on the farm for several days after the murders, living in the house, feeding the livestock, and eating meals in the kitchen. Neighbors noticed smoke from the chimney and assumed the family was home. The case was never solved. American criminologists studied the Hinterkaifeck murders extensively because it represented a type of crime, the patient, methodical killer who remains at the scene, that would later appear in American criminal cases. The methodical nature of the crime, the isolation, the killer's strange decision to stay, all became elements that appeared in American true crime literature and influenced how investigators approached similar cases. Sometimes the worst American nightmares are imported from elsewhere, learned from tragedies that happened across the ocean, then recreated on domestic soil. Speaking of things lurking in domestic waters, let's search a lake. Champ, America's Loch Ness Monster. Here's the thing about Champ: Vermont and New York have both passed laws protecting it, just in case it's real. Lake Champlain, straddling the border between Vermont and New York, has generated reports of a large aquatic creature since the 1600s. Samuel de Champlain himself allegedly described seeing an unusual creature during his exploration of the lake. Since then, over 300 sightings have been documented. Witnesses describe a long-necked creature, dark in color, moving through the water in ways inconsistent with known fish or mammals. In 1977, Sandra Mansi photographed something in the lake, a dark shape with what appears to be a head and neck protruding from the water. The photograph has been analyzed extensively. Some declare it a hoax, others say it's genuine but misidentified. No definitive evidence of a large unknown creature has been found, but the sightings continue. Vermont and New York have both passed laws protecting Champ from harm, just in case. It's the only cryptid with legal protection in 2 states. Whether Champ is a surviving plesiosaur, a large sturgeon, mass hallucination, or elaborate hoax, Lake Champlain holds something that hundreds of people have seen and no one has caught. Speaking of things no one has caught, let's enter a wax museum. The Madame Tussauds factor. Here's the thing about wax museums: when you make something that looks too much like a living human, something in the brain refuses to accept that it isn't. Madame Tussauds began her career making death masks of guillotine victims during the French Revolution. When her wax museum tradition came to America, it brought both artistry and eeriness. Multiple American wax museums have reported figures appearing to move, breathe, or shift position during overnight hours when the buildings are empty. Security footage occasionally captures shadows moving near statues. Temperature fluctuations occur around specific figures. Several museums have been investigated by paranormal teams. The rational explanation is that wax expands and contracts with temperature changes, creating the illusion of movement. The unsettling explanation is that extremely lifelike representations of human forms, especially those modeled after the dead, occupy an uncanny valley that disturbs our perception. When you make something too close to human, something in our brain rebels. We see breath where there is none. We see movement in stillness. Wax museums exist in that uncomfortable space between art and replication, between the living and the dead. You're looking at something that looks like it should be alive but isn't. And sometimes, in the corner of your eye, it seems like it is. Speaking of things that seem alive, let's follow some footprints. The devil's footprints. Here's the thing about the devil's footprints. Similar unexplained tracks have been reported across New England, the Appalachians, and the Pacific Northwest for over a century, and they don't match any known animal. In February of 1855, residents across Devon, England awoke to find mysterious hoof-like footprints in the snow stretching over 100 miles. The footprints appeared to go over rooftops, through walls, and across the River Exe without breaking stride. While this occurred in England, Similar unexplained footprint phenomena have been reported multiple times across rural New England, the Appalachian Mountains, and the Pacific Northwest. Witnesses describe waking to find tracks that shouldn't exist, hoof prints that climb vertical walls, footprints that appear in impossible locations, trails that start and stop with no origin or destination. Most are dismissed as natural phenomena, misinterpreted, or hoaxes. But the consistency of reports across different time periods and geographic locations creates a pattern. Something leaves marks in snow, mud, and dust that don't match any known animal. The tracks appear overnight and disappear with the next weather. Whether devil, cryptid, or atmospheric anomaly, the footprints keep appearing century after century, defying explanation with each mysterious step. And speaking of mysterious steps, let's climb some stairs in a very cluttered house. The Collier brothers. Here's the thing about the Collier brothers. Langley's body was found just 10 feet from where Homer had died, crushed by one of his own booby traps while bringing food to his brother. In March of 1947, police received a report that someone had died in a brownstone in Harlem, New York. When they broke into the home of Homer and Langley Collier, they found Homer's body sitting in a chair, surrounded by mountains of hoarded material. The brothers had lived as recluses for decades, filling their home with newspapers, musical instruments, car parts, broken furniture, and stranger items including 14 pianos and a Model T Ford. Booby traps had been set throughout the house to deter intruders. Police searched for Langley but couldn't find him. 2 weeks later, workers clearing debris discovered Langley's body just 10 feet from where Homer had been found. He'd been crushed to death by one of his own booby traps while bringing food to his paralyzed brother. Homer, unable to move, had then starved to death. The final inventory of the house cataloged over 140 tons of material. It took months to clear. The Collier brothers became synonymous with compulsive hoarding, two men who barricaded themselves behind possessions until those possessions became their tomb. The house was eventually demolished. But their story remains a cautionary tale about isolation, mental illness, and the dangers of holding on too tightly. Speaking of holding on, let's follow a woman who won't let go. The crying woman of La Llorona. Here's the thing about La Llorona. The descriptions of her are remarkably consistent across 400 years and multiple states from witnesses who've never heard of each other. The legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman, has existed in the American Southwest for over 400 years, predating the U.S. acquisition of the territory. The story varies slightly by region, but the core remains consistent. A woman, overcome by grief or madness, drowns her children in a river. Realizing what she's done, she drowns herself. Her spirit is condemned to wander waterways for eternity, weeping and searching for her lost children. Witnesses from Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California have reported encounters with a woman in white near rivers and streams, always crying, always searching. The descriptions are remarkably consistent across states, decades, and cultural backgrounds. A woman in a flowing white dress, long dark hair, visible at night near water, weeping uncontrollably. Children are warned not to go near rivers at night, or La Llorona might mistake them for her own and drag them into the water. Whether the legend reflects a historical tragedy, a cautionary tale to keep children safe, or genuine encounters with a restless spirit, La Llorona has become embedded in Southwestern culture. She is grief personified, wandering the rivers, unable to rest, unable to stop searching for something she can never find. Speaking of things that can never be found, let's discuss a disease that almost destroyed a city. The plague ship. Here's the thing about the San Francisco plague outbreak. City leaders denied it for months to protect business, and that decision allowed the disease to spread and kill. In the summer of 1900, The steamship SS Australia arrived in San Francisco harbor, carrying passengers infected with bubonic plague. The disease spread into the city's Chinatown neighborhood. The city government and business leaders denied the outbreak for months, fearing economic damage from quarantine and trade restrictions. When they finally acknowledged the plague, the response was discriminatory and medically questionable. Chinatown was quarantined while white neighborhoods with cases were not. Buildings were fumigated. Residents were forced to submit to experimental vaccines. The denial and mismanagement allowed the disease to spread. Over 100 people died before the outbreak was finally contained in 1904. Then in 1907, plague returned to San Francisco. Another 160 deaths occurred before it was controlled. The plague had established itself in the ground squirrel population of California, where it persists to this day. Every few years, cases of bubonic plague are still reported in the rural western United States. It never left. We just learned to live with it, to treat it with antibiotics, to avoid the places it hides. The SS Australia brought more than passengers. It brought a disease that became a permanent resident. Speaking of permanent residents, let's decrypt some letters. The Zodiac Killer's ciphers. Here's the thing about the Zodiac Killer's ciphers. One of them went unsolved for 51 years, and two of them remain unsolved to this day. Between 1968 and 1970, a serial killer known as the Zodiac terrorized Northern California. He killed at least 5 people, possibly more, and sent taunting letters to newspapers. 4 of those letters contained encrypted messages. The first cipher was solved within a week by a high school teacher and his wife. It contained a rambling message about killing being the most thrilling experience. Pray. The second cipher wasn't solved until December of 2020, 51 years after it was sent. It was cracked by a team of code breakers using modern computing power and revealed another cryptic message offering no useful clues to the killer's identity. 2 ciphers remain unsolved to this day. The Zodiac Killer was never identified. Despite thousands of tips, suspects, and decades of investigation, he simply stopped killing and vanished into obscurity. The unsolved ciphers might contain his name, or they might be meaningless gibberish designed to waste investigative resources. We may never know. The Zodiac remains free, either dead from natural causes or living quietly somewhere, holding the answers to questions that have haunted investigators for over 50 years. Speaking of answers hidden underground, let's descend beneath the Capitol, the catacombs of Washington, D.C. Here's the thing about the crypt beneath the U.S. Capitol. It was built specifically to hold George Washington's body, and Washington's family refused to let it be used. Directly beneath the United States Capitol building, there exists a large crypt with a circular opening in its center. It was originally designed to hold the body of George Washington. The plan was for Washington's tomb to be directly below the rotunda, making him literally the foundation of American democracy. Visitors could look down through the opening and see his sarcophagus. Washington's family refused. They wanted him to remain at Mount Vernon, as he'd requested in his will. So the crypt was never used for its intended purpose. Today it's used for storage and occasional exhibits. But the empty tomb remains, a circular chamber with a hole in its ceiling, built for a body that never came. The acoustics are strange, footsteps echo, voices carry in unexpected ways. It's not officially haunted, but it feels like it should be. An empty grave beneath the Capitol, waiting for a president who refused to fill it, is somehow more unsettling than if Washington had actually been entombed there. Speaking of unsettling things, let's talk about a figure that appears in bedrooms. The shadow people of Hat Man. Here's the thing about the Hat Man. Thousands of people who've never heard of each other, across different states and different decades, have all reported seeing the exact same figure wearing the exact same hat. Across the United States, thousands of unconnected witnesses have reported seeing the same entity during episodes of sleep paralysis or in the moments between waking and sleeping. They describe a tall shadow figure, distinctly humanoid, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The reports are strikingly consistent. Same height, same proportions, same hat, same sense of menace. Witnesses are from different states, different backgrounds, different decades, yet they describe the same figure. Sleep researchers attribute the phenomenon to hypnagogic hallucinations, the brain creating images during the transition between sleep and wakefulness. The consistency is explained by common fears and archetypal imagery. But that doesn't explain why so many people who've never heard of each other's experiences see the exact same figure wearing the exact same hat. The Hat Man has become a modern folklore entity, shared across the internet, discussed in forums, reported to paranormal investigators. Whether he's a genuine entity, a shared hallucination, or proof that human brains are wired to create similar nightmares, the Hat Man has stepped out of individual bedrooms and into collective consciousness. Speaking of collective consciousness, let's walk some very specific roads. America's Corpse Roads. Here's the thing about America's Corpse Roads. Many of them still exist, paved over and incorporated into modern streets, and people drive them every day without knowing what they were built for. In colonial New England, communities designated specific paths called corpse roads or coffin paths, used exclusively for transporting bodies from homes to burial grounds. The practice was rooted in European tradition and superstition. People believed that a spirit would haunt the path it was carried on after death. To prevent ghosts from finding their way back to homes, corpse roads were deliberately built with sharp turns, confusing angles, and sometimes even designed to cross running water, which spirits supposedly couldn't traverse. Some communities maintained separate roads for the living and the dead. You didn't walk on a corpse road unless you were in a funeral procession. To do so was considered deeply unlucky, an invitation for spirits to attach themselves to you. Many of these roads still exist, now paved over or incorporated into modern streets. People drive them daily, unaware they're traveling paths once reserved for the dead. The belief that spirits followed coffins seems quaint now. But those sharp turns remain, built into the landscape, a permanent record of our ancestors' fear of being followed home by ghosts. Speaking of being followed, let's check into a sanatorium. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Here's the thing about Waverly Hills Sanatorium. To avoid demoralizing the living patients, they transported the dead out through a secret underground tunnel. Between 1910 and 1961, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky treated thousands of tuberculosis patients. During the worst years of the epidemic, death was common. Estimates suggest between 6,000 and 8,000 people died in the building. To avoid demoralizing living patients, bodies were transported through a 500-foot underground tunnel called the Body Chute that led from the hospital to the bottom of the hill. The living used the front entrance. The dead used the tunnel. Waverly Hills closed when antibiotics made sanatoriums obsolete. The building sat abandoned for decades before being purchased and partially restored. It's now a popular destination for paranormal investigators. Visitors report shadow figures in hallways, unexplained voices, a woman in white on the third floor, and the sound of children playing in the empty children's ward. Whether haunted or not, Waverly Hills carries the weight of its history. Thousands of people arrived, desperate, and died slowly. The Body Chute still exists, dark and sloping downward. You can walk through it if you want. Just know that thousands made that journey before you, heading in only one direction. Speaking of one-way journeys, let's dig up a bottle. The Stanfield Witch Bottle. Here's the thing about the Stanfield Witch Bottle. Someone living through the Civil War was so frightened of unseen forces that they buried a bottle full of nails under their fireplace to protect themselves. In 2020, archaeologists excavating a site in Virginia discovered a Civil War-era glass bottle buried beneath a fireplace. Inside were iron nails, pins, bent brass pieces, and an unidentified liquid. The bottle was identified as a witch bottle, a protective charm used to trap evil spirits, curses, and negative energy. The practice originated in England but was common in colonial America and persisted into the 1800s. The bottles were filled with sharp objects and sometimes urine, then sealed and buried. The theory was that malicious spirits would be drawn to the bottle and trapped by the sharp objects inside, preventing them from harming the home's occupants. Hundreds of witch bottles have been found across the eastern United States during archaeological excavations. The Stanfield bottle is unusual because it dates to the Civil War era, a time when such practices were declining. Someone living through the war, dealing with violence, uncertainty, and death on an unprecedented scale, decided they needed protection from forces science couldn't explain. So they buried a bottle full of nails under their fireplace and hoped it would keep evil at bay. Speaking of keeping things at bay, here's the final truth. The last fact is about you. Right now, as you're listening to this, you are statistically within 200 miles of at least one unsolved disappearance, one mass grave, one location with documented paranormal reports, and one site where your government conducted experiments they never fully disclosed. American history isn't just in museums and monuments. It's under your feet, buried in unmarked graves, sealed in abandoned buildings, hidden in classified documents. It's down the road, around the corner, beneath the place you live. Most of it has never been explained. Most of it never will be. The United States is only 250 years old, but we've managed to accumulate centuries worth of mysteries, tragedies, and secrets. Some are paranormal, some are criminal. Some are just the accumulated weight of millions of people living, dying, and leaving traces behind. You're part of that history now. One day, you'll be a story someone tells, whether in a history book, a family legend, or a documentary like this one. So rest easy tonight, knowing that you're surrounded by the unexplained. It's been there all along. You just weren't paying attention. Until now. Sleep well. And that brings us to the present day, and to you. Right now, you're lying in bed, comfortable and safe, surrounded by history you didn't know existed until tonight. Somewhere within 200 miles of where you're sleeping, there's an unsolved mystery, an abandoned building with stories to tell, or a piece of ground that holds secrets no one has uncovered. American history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's layered beneath us, built into our cities, buried in our soil. Most of it we'll never fully understand. And honestly, that's what makes it fascinating. So the next time you drive past an old building, walk through a quiet cemetery, or hear a story that seems too strange to be true, remember that truth has always been stranger than fiction in America. If you enjoyed falling asleep to this strange side of history, hit that subscribe button. There's plenty more where this came from. Sleep well tonight, knowing you're part of a story that's still being written. And try not to think too hard about what might be buried in your backyard. Sweet dreams.